Hey everybody, I'm going to talk today about death systems, mortality, and society. In this brief talk, I'm going to be covering some of the most salient points of Chapter 4 from our textbook. At the end of this short talk, I'm going to review a concept in medical ethics called who gets to decide the death of someone. And I want you to consider the example I'm going to give you, and then come to the question, who does get to decide? And allow yourself the time and space to question that and ask yourself why. When you come to a decision, ask yourself why. Now, this is not something you got to post on Canvas. It's just something I want you to consider with yourself. And you can talk to others about it too as a hypothetical. But it's a real life example, and I want you to ask yourself the question, under certain circumstances, who gets to have the final decision on life or death? Okay, so let's look at the concept of a death system, and that's a network of 6 basic components. And the first one is people of a death system, and they generally include funeral directors, life insurance agents, even weapons designers, but also caregivers of the dying like hospice and what have you. Then there's places, which include cemeteries, funeral homes, even battlefields, war memorials like the Vietnam War Wall, the Memory Wall, and the disaster sites such as the 911. And thirdly, there's times, which is commemorative days such as Memorial Day or Good Friday, Halloween, and Dia de los Muertos, for an example. And then fourthly are objects of a death system such as obituaries, tombstones, hearses, and the electric chair, for an example. Fifthly are symbols of a death system such as black armbands to acknowledge someone of great importance who had passed away. There's funeral music, skull and crossbones. And then lastly, the internet, which is a kind of thanatological death system in and of itself. The functions of the death system will vary among different societies, but generally include these elements. There's usually some kind of warnings and predictions about potentially life-threatening events, such as fires, storms, earthquakes, pandemics, recalls, etc. Then there's preventing death, such as what happens in the emergency room of hospitals or acute medical care clinics. There's also public health messages that try to help individuals make informed decisions about what they do. And then thirdly, persons who care for the dying are an integral part of the death system, such as nurses, trauma workers, first-line responders, caregivers, etc. And then there's disposing of the dead, which would include cemeteries, cemetery plots, crematories, etc. And then, importantly, social consolidation after death, such as bereavement, coping with grief, settling estates. And then there's making sense of death, such as religious or spiritual or scientific explanations, certainly arts and music. And then lastly, killing is capital punishment, war, hunting, are also elements of a death system. There's the certification of death. They reflect both a private and public function of the death system. And the document, at first glance, seems like a straightforward certificate that summarizes the facts of the death and data about the deceased. Footnote here, funeral directors are usually the ones who complete and file death certificates. Certificates of death also assist in helping with crime detection. They can help with tracking genealogy and family history. And they can also be important for gaining knowledge about the incident of disease and other aspects of physical and psychological health. The certification of death provides 4 different modes of death. Modes of death: accidental, suicidal, homicidal, and natural. The cause of death isn't always the same as the mode of death. For an example, the cause of death might be asphyxiation due to drowning. But was the drowning the result of an accident, suicide, homicide, or some other mode? And that's the area that perhaps what a coroner will investigate when the death is suspicious. So there's a difference between a coroner and a medical examiner. TV is usually wrong. They don't get that one right because, it's a different format, not necessarily interested in accuracy or facts. But in fact, the coroner is very different from the medical examiner. Most deaths in the United States result from disease, and the physician attending the patient certifies the cause of death. However, when suspicious circumstances, like the example of asphyxiation due to drowning, and that's involved, the cause must be determined by a coroner or a medical examiner, who are both known as death investigators. Coroners are usually law enforcement, usually out of a sheriff's office, but medical examiners are physicians, medical doctors, with advanced training in forensic pathology. In our county, the coroner is the sheriff or his appointees, deputy sheriffs, and the medical examiner is a physician and forensic pathologist who works out of the sheriff's office, Dr. Fiore in our county. So again, varies by county. Most coroners are out of the law enforcement, usually sheriff. But anyway, medical examiner is required to have a medical degree with additional education in pathology and forensic pathology. They have to be forensic pathologists. This is the primary difference between an ME, medical examiner, and a coroner. Coroner is usually not a physician, and nor are they trained in medicine or forensic pathology. A medical examiner is usually an appointed officer. A coroner is an elected official, like the sheriff, and coroners lead investigations into a cause of death when the death is suspicious. They might contract with a physician to perform the actual medical examination or autopsy. Autopsy is from the Greek word meaning autopsia, seeing with one's own eyes, and a detailed medical examination of a body after death determines cause of death or to investigate the nature of the changes caused by disease. And in this example, it's showing you a autopsy result from the chief medical examiner. The cause of death is sudden cardiopulmonary arrest due to, in this examination, prone restraint, N-ethylpentalone, which is kind of like a cathinone like MDMA or methamphetamine, cocaine, and alcohol use, hypertensive and arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So this just gives you the example of an autopsy report looking at the cause of death. Why an autopsy? Well, it satisfies legal requirements of a coroner's or a medical examiner's investigation. It's part of a hospital's teaching or research program to determine whether a genetic or infectious condition caused the death. And it helps resolve questions about malpractice. And it identifies, lastly, human remains in war, human rights violations, or catastrophic accidents. Historically, the death has been determined by the absence of any heartbeat and breathing, and most deaths are still determined by these vital signs in some manner. However, when respirators and ventilators and other life support systems are used to artificially sustain life, really the conventional means of determining death are inadequate. So these issues are not simply biomedically based. A definition of death is not simply biomedical, but also shaped and driven by a series of sociological influences as well. Interestingly, some time ago, there are historical accounts of people being considered dead who, in fact, were not. The fear of being buried alive stemmed from the period of great plagues and epidemics hundreds of years ago, when a mistaken determination of death could result from a state of illness that only mimicked death. As a safeguard against the threat of being buried alive, some people arranged to be placed in a coffin with a bell tied to their hands. Then, should consciousness return after a mistaken determination of death, they could ring the bell after their burial to let people know on the outside that they were still alive. In fact, the term dead ringer is said to have come from this era. And you see that illustration below. So conventional signs of death and new technology includes three areas: brain death, clinical death, and cellular death. In brain death, it's defined as the lack of response to external stimuli. So the senses aren't registering. Sight, sound, taste, temperature, etc., etc. There's the absence of spontaneous muscle movement and breathing, the absence of observable reflexes, including brain and spinal reflexes, the absence of brain activity signified by a flat EEG, as you see in the picture below, and the person is comatose, and the cause is known. Whereas clinical death is a determination made according to accepted medical criteria, either the cessation of heartbeat and breathing or the criteria establishing brain death, as we looked at just a bit ago. And then there's lastly cellular death, that results when heartbeat, respiration, and brain activity stop. And body death, or somatic death, is followed by a progressive disintegration of body tissues in the absence of breathing and circulation. And then Robert Veitch, an important figure in medical ethics, he's a medical ethicist from Georgetown University, really says we need to move towards a much broader determination and definition of death. And he proposes 4 levels concerning that. One is the irreversible flow of vital fluids, and those are related to heart, beat, circulation, and breathing. But not just that. 2 is the irreversible loss of soul from the body. Now this one's really difficult to describe because it's hard to evaluate and define what soul is. But Veitch argues that throughout most cultures and religions, there's this belief that as long as the soul is present, the person is alive. And when the soul leaves, the body dies. So prevalent is that belief that Veitch decided to include that in his redetermination of death. 3, the irreversible loss of capacity for bodily integration. That's referencing the concept of homeostasis, that the body does not have any longer the ability to conduct more generalized regulation with its own functioning. And lastly, the irreversible loss of capacity for consciousness or social interaction. This is related to the social dimensions of life, including consciousness and personhood, of which we're still trying to understand what the mind is. But it's also in the interaction between consciousness with one's environment and with other human beings. Veitch states that the current whole brain definition of death establishes a view of what is essential to being alive, but he argues rather than imposing one approach on everyone, the right to opt out could be made available to persons whose belief about how to define death of a human being conflicts with the whole brain approach. Regardless, the questions about defining death are not yet fully resolved, even after more than 4 decades. Now you'd think that it would be simple. The brain flatlines and the heart stops and breathing stops. But again, it doesn't seem to be adequate to describe the various aspects of the process of death and dying. And then this is the last medical ethics question I wanted to leave you with. And I'm not sure we have time for the video link, but basically what it's showing is the case of Charlie Gard. In 2017, doctors from an English or British children's hospital diagnosed a baby with an incurable genetic disease. The infant, called baby Charlie, required ongoing ventilation or he'd die. The doctors at the hospital keeping Charlie connected to the machines that keep him alive is unnecessarily prolonging the baby's pain, they recommended. Charlie's parents, on the other hand, are open to trying every possibility of saving the baby's life, including some experimental treatments in the United States. The Children's Hospital applied to the High Court because they disagreed with the parents, confirming that removing the ventilation would be legal, having judged that it was not only in baby Charlie's best interest, but it was supporting his prognosis. After hearing the case, the High Court in England ruled in favor of the hospital. They could disconnect baby Charlie. This was confirmed by the Supreme Court and the European Court of Human Rights. So the question is, for you, that you consider, as an ethical issue in cases involving a child, who should have the final decision of life and death? The courts or the parents? Now, most people will immediately say, oh, well, the parents. But think about it. And whatever answer you have, ask yourself, why did I answer that? Okay, I'll see you around next time.